Outlive is bringing a few firsts to the PC Engine. It's our first PC Engine game by Sunsoft, and the first dungeon crawler, though you'd never be able to tell from the title screen that it was a dungeon crawler. Sunsoft's presence on the PC Engine is going to be very minor, though they are at least going to try a few CD-ROM games. This is another case of a big publisher on other platforms dipping their toe in and then backing off entirely. As for Outlive being the first dungeon crawler, that's a genre that was on its way out in 1989, though the PC Engine is going to get a few respectable entries in it. A dungeon crawler is a style of RPG where your view is from the first-person perspective of someone exploring the dungeon. Movement's done in steps because at the time it was invented, 3D graphics and smooth movement for this weren't really viable. The granddaddy of the dungeon crawler is Wizardry, a game that laid out a lot of the structure that RPGs would carry forward, like random encounters and menu command-based combat. Outlive is definitely in that Wizardry mold, even if the props and set dressing are science fiction rather than fantasy. The story in Outlive is that you're an Imperial reconnaissance pilot. You've been sent to the planet Lafra, where you'll uncover a conspiracy in the spider web-like tunnels that encompass the planet. And that's it. I wasn't even summarizing, I was reading from the manual. The way the game works is that you start at an outpost, where there's a maintenance depot where you can refuel and rearm your mech, a weapons shop where you can buy more guns, an armor shop to upgrade your defenses, an item shop to buy supplies, and a saloon where you can talk to a couple people to advance the story. Then you enter the maze of tunnels, and then once you've fought through that labyrinth, you arrive at the next outpost, which has the same maintenance depot, shops, and saloon, and then you connect to the next set of tunnels. And so it repeats. There are 8 city-connecting dungeons like this, and they all look exactly the same. There are regions where the color of the lights are different, but that's the only thing that changes. And about 90% of the time, the path is just the yellow lights. You might say to yourself, okay, they've got dungeons. Surely the dungeons must be worth exploring. Nope, not at all. There isn't a single feature in the dungeons, except the doors linking the different colored sections, the towns at either end of the maze, and the monsters. Very rarely, there will be a boss fight for you to encounter somewhere in that maze. But really, these dungeons are effectively empty. There's nothing here. They're not even especially interesting mazes, because it's not a bunch of twisting paths. It's just a fork where one way will be wrong and one way will be right. In fact, there's huge chunks of these dungeons where it's the wrong path. So are you turned left instead of right at the 3rd junction, out of the 6 that comprise the entire path between towns. Now you're off in a block that's 2/3 of the maze all by itself. The dungeons are absurdly huge for something so empty. The kind of map where you have to redraw it a couple of times if you're mapping it out on graph paper, because you keep running out of room. The only thing in Outlive is the grind. And oh boy, is it a grind. You have random encounters in the dungeon, and considering that your mech's view places its height at roughly the middle of the hall, and your opponent's height puts them at about the top of the lights, you must be wandering the dungeon attacking robots that are roughly the size of Roombas. When you get into a battle, your options are gun, which is the standard attack, option, which are special weapons that you've picked up, item for the things in your inventory, data for information on the enemy, flee, and status, which is information on you. You can have up to 4 guns, each with a different attribute. A normal gun, a fire gun, an ice gun, and a lightning gun. Now you might think, okay, you use the appropriate gun on the appropriate enemy. Oh, you have it so wrong. No, the effectiveness of your gun depends on the color of the walls. The same enemies appear throughout the dungeon regardless of the area that you're in, so it's not like they even have different environments that they hang out in. It's just a matter of knowing to pick a different gun when you enter a different color. The options all have limited ammunition. They're things like missile packs or flamethrowers. You can replenish these at the maintenance bay in town. Your mech has hit points, which are referred to as SE, and recovering those is also done in the maintenance bay, so you could also use an item. When you defeat an enemy, you get target points, as well as separate experience for attack and defense. And how many of those points you get is determined by how many times you are shot at and how many times you shot. You have separate levels for attack and defense for some reason, even though those will progress at generally the same rate. These levels solely affect the hit chance, both the enemies and yours. And if the levels are sufficiently unbalanced, then it is impossible to hit. And that's a two-way street when it comes to out-leveling. This actually becomes an issue in the second half of the game, when there's a sudden enormous leap in the levels of enemies that you'll face, and you'll have to go back to earlier parts of the game and grind until you're nearly max level in order to make any kind of progress. The target points are transformed into cash when you get back to town. How much cash depends on which town you go to. And now I have to talk about the economy in Outlive, because it's broken. When I first started up, I bought a different style of gun so I'd have two options, but that was all of my cash. Then I wandered out into the dungeon, and I found out that when you're starting out, you can only take about 4 hits total. I defeated 2 enemies, which was all I was capable of doing, and then retreated back to town, where I discovered I hadn't earned enough money to get repaired. Right from the start, the scaling in Outlive is broken. You need to retain a lot of your starting cash, because until you can survive to the second town, you're not going to earn enough for proper recovery. Now, if you do get destroyed by the monsters out in the dungeon, you wind up back at town with full hit points, but losing any progress that you made while in the dungeon. Though I also found a bug with that. If you die to acid damage, which is the only status effect in the game and causes your mech to get damaged with every step, then when you revive back in town, you have 0 hit points. Yeah, Outlive is a mess. The prices on everything are in the thousands, and you're earning maybe a couple of hundred a trip. And that's once you've progressed far enough in the dungeons where you're a few towns in. It becomes immediately obvious that really the only thing to do is advance as far as you can in towns, and then just walk around back and forth outside of them until you have the cash to buy the equipment to carry you to the next town. There are some quests that can get you a little bit more money, but it's not that much more. Outlive is a game that is dedicated to making you grind in the most boring way possible, in the most boring environments imaginable. Now, since Outlive is a hue card, there is no battery save. Instead, you get a password when you return to town. Now, the password is actually rather long, 40 characters. It's a pain to enter this one. Despite all of the obvious flaws, Outlive proved to be kind of popular. I found some commenters saying that people with PC engines at the time were starved for RPGs. And I still find it difficult to believe that even if you were starved for RPGs, you'd find Outlive entertaining. But for some reason, it got a remake on the original PlayStation, Outlive Be Eliminate Yesterday. And it seems that version was also popular, since it got a budget re-release. My feeling on Outlive is it's all of the worst aspects of RPGs from the 1980s, and none of the positive ones. This is just dreadful to play. It's not interesting to explore, it's not interesting to fight, and of course there isn't an interesting story. Outlive is truly awful. The only reason you'd ever want to play this one is as a sleep aid.